Hey guys, thank you all for joining us for our webinar here for OIC today. I have Steve Saddleback on the line, and I also have Ryan. Ryan, can you hear us?
I can hear you, yep.
Awesome. We just don't have Ryan on camera, but we do have Steve here, so maybe we can let them get this kicked off. I'll start with Steve. You can go ahead and do your introduction, Steve, please. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, and appreciate it to the chamber to host this webinar today. Here, pleased to be here with you today. My name is Steve Saddleback. I'm from the Indian Resource Council. I'm the director of the National Energy Business Center of Excellence. And IRC is an advocacy organization started in 1987 that works on behalf of First Nations involved in responsible energy development, primarily in oil and gas. And we're a national organization based out of here in Calgary. Our head office is on Stoney Nation. And we work with communities from coast to coast, where we provide education, advocacy, communication. We also work in a number of areas such as regulatory development. We work with the federal government and provincial governments on regulations, as well as putting pen to paper when it comes to laws and that affect First Nation communities, as well as the greater Canada. So it's taking a real-time proactive approach to being involved in having First Nations industry as well as communities and the public at the table, looking for ways to get our resources to market. Hey, welcome, Ryan.
Hi guys, sorry, you just want a quick intro? I just ran out of different meetings, so I'm
no
trying to
worries.
play catch up here.
Thanks. Yeah, we're just doing some intros.
Sure. So my name is Ryan Robb. I'm currently CEO for Stoney Tribal Administration. With this pandemic, I'd be also what we call the Deputy Incident Commander, which we follow what's called Incident Command System, ICS protocol, which is fairly standard in the industry side, but relatively unknown in First Nations land. So right now we're trying to make sure that our nations have the same opportunities for success as every other group has. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my camera squared away here. I'm actually going to close some curtains because I think it's probably too light in here.
Yeah, that looks good.
Did absolutely nothing, so I just can't look as good as Steve, that's all.
All right, guys, so if you want to just would like to hear from each one of you, a little bit about how this whole pandemic has altered the life and the business in First Nation communities from your different perspectives.
Sure. Would you like to go first, Ryan?
No, go ahead, Steve. I'll follow.
Okay. So it's this whole the pandemic and everything has been really interesting. It's really kind of tossed the whole world on its head, and it was something that, from IRC's perspective, we were monitoring the situation, I guess you could say. It was something that we were aware of back in when you start to hear snippets from January and kind of at the beginning of the year. We held the Indigenous Participation in Major Projects Conference here in Calgary at the end of February. In our planning sessions, it wasn't really something that we talked about a whole lot when we started our planning late in 2019. When we came back to the office in 2020, suddenly things were starting to creep up onto the radar. So we were watching it from there as we were bringing First Nations from across the country to come together to talk about Indigenous, participation and looking into 2020 and making a lot of plans as to what we're going to be able to do for the upcoming year. Both looking at it from equity positions to construction to education, and really having a major, really getting excited about things. And to be completely honest, while we were preparing for those and we're getting ready and kind of looking at the positive side of things and expecting that, things ultimately changed. We had the conference at the end of February. Great event. We had over 400 plus participants from across Canada and international. We had representation there from Japan, from China, and many folks were really excited, and we were really it kind of gave some life back into the industry. That there are a lot of positive stories. We recognized what was happening prior to, and from that, First Nations were involved, and we were there was a lot of folks that were really excited about going into the future. Went away, and we held that event right at the end of February. Flip over to March. Suddenly, life is fundamentally changed. Things are starting to go into lockdown, and many communities are. It was almost that first week of March there that folks were, first week and a half that folks were out there working and still attending events, and suddenly life changed. So that's I guess the nutshell from my side of things that I've seen, and we are currently responding to it. But yeah, maybe Ryan, if you wanted to kind of give your how you've seen things.
Yeah. So go back again and ask me what the question was. You gave such a good answer, I started to lose it. How's our life changed since?
Yeah, basically just the impact, how life and businesses has been impacted, especially in First Nations communities.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we use ICS Pro out here. There's a number of us that have actually, I'm technically on leave from Suncor, but it's probably not looking real healthy that I'm going back this year. So I'll probably need to extend my leave. And we have people from TransCanada and AECOM and sort of groups like that. So our Director of Emergency Management in his normal day, that's now our incident commander, is a fellow that's spent 30 years as in for Calgary firefighters or fire service. For the most part, we had actually started to recognize that we had holes, not really that, but we had certainly identified that we had holes in our emergency response plans. All secured from Trans Mountain because we're a consultation nation using some plan.
Ryan, you're getting a little cut off.
Sorry, I'm getting some noise.
Maybe let's see if we turn off.
Here?
Let me see if we turn off your camera, it might help. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, it sounds better.
Hopefully that's better. Okay. So we had just started to identify where we thought we might have some holes or weaknesses. Were impacted fairly heavily by the 2013 floods that went through Calgary, and Stoney lost hundreds of houses. And so as we were doing sort of some look at what could come out of an emergency response plan from Trans Mountain, we also tried to look at some of our historical responses and how we had done with those. And again, since many of us came from industry and the chiefs knowingly went out and hired lots of us that came from industry, Part of what we brought was to start to roll out a better protocol or to deal with this. So early January, we had mandated, and we have all told between most of our companies, excluding the casino, about 600, 650 employees. So we had just rolled out and we had just mandated in early January that we wanted all of our employees to at least have level 100 of CS. All senior managers at least level 200. And should we need others at 300, we would do that. So we managed to get probably 100, 150 through level 100. We got about half of our elected officials through elected officials training through the AEMA to do that. So when this started to hit, we weren't starting from scratch. We at least had an understanding and a structure of what our incident command system would look like when we rolled it out. So as you can probably imagine, for the most part, all of our businesses are shut, including the casino and the hotel. All of our on reserve work, because we're a huge utilidor. So all of that type of work is now shut down, with the exception of if it's a safety issue. So we just had some lines where we had to send some people out with Ultralink TransAlta that were potential fire issues, because that's the next big concern we have as we're starting to get to fire season. So running our protocols has certainly helped us. It'll help us at the back end of this too, tracking costs. That's a huge component of it. So it's changed, obviously, in that most things are shut down, but it's a little bit of a nice story too, that the leadership of the three nations have recognized that we need to do things differently, and they brought in the people to do it. And we're actually bringing best practices from industry to First Nations now. And I think that's probably stories that don't get told nearly as much as they should be told. Siksika may be using ICS, but there's very, very few, might be some in the north from the fires around Fort McMurray area, they may have instituted it. But from our perspective, we don't see why First Nations should have any less of a outcome or any less of an opportunity to have as good an outcome and as well structured and organized as any industry is. Now, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because I can tell you what I'm short on and what we're going to need. We can identify it. Whether we can access PPE or other things becomes a different story after that, with this being precedented. But certainly we're better organized, and as we come out of this, we should be better organized, so we're not still having problems 4, 5, 6, 7 years later, just doing the paper chase, because it's going to be enormous amounts of paper that are going to be having to be dealt with on this pandemic. Hope that's enough for you.
Yeah, if I could add, Gabe and Justin, in terms of some things that I'm seeing from our members and communities across the country, you know, there has been a lot of First Nations that were, you know, while we had mentioned that, you know, communities were starting to see those responses, there was some activity that has been occurring. It's been kind of you know, an ongoing, as Ryan had mentioned, there was the emergency response planning. There was an initiative that came out from the federal government about a year or two ago that you know, worked with First Nations to start to build a little bit of emergency response planning, and that had to do, you know, primarily with things like you were seeing, like fires and such. Now, did it necessarily, you know, take into account something like COVID-19? You know, it was a piece of the puzzle, if you will. So it helped some First Nations that were able to access that program and to be able to identify who are going to be the emergency response and those key you know, those key people within the community that will enact in case of a you know, in case of a situation like we're dealing with, such as Ryan and you know, working with the nations. We've seen responses from the federal level with aid packages going out to First Nations. There's $100 million for planning But then, that sounds like a lot of money, but when you break it down, there's, for those that don't know, there's 640 First Nations across Canada. That doesn't include the Inuit and the Métis, where, our brothers to the north and Métis communities across the nation. There's also $305 million with the Indigenous Community Support Fund. So, I mean, when you do the math and all of that, they sound like really big numbers, but we're going to continue to face challenges. It does give some assistance to those communities to be able to top up of those, but for the long haul, we recognize that everything that you see. I watch the Prime Minister's address and follow the news just like everybody else there, and we recognize what the curves were going to look like. And when you look at the math and everything, and you see the exponential figures that are going to be happening, it's going to be a challenge for the long term. On the provincial side of things, what the response has been depending on the province. From the local side of things, some communities have locked down very early. Some communities are very remote, so the chances of contact happening there, while they are low, we got to recognize that those communities also don't necessarily have the medical centers or the access to the world-class facilities. Like our some of our major cities. So there's a bit of give and take in there, that there are those challenges, but there are a little bit of opportunity where maybe it is you try to look for the positive on things and go, is the chance of contact happening within a community? It's pretty low. So you try to look at the bright side on things. When there was a question that was asked there is, what are the 3 top issues that we're facing? It would be the exposure to the communities. I myself am from Stoney Nation, which is in Musqueam and here in central Alberta. And exposure within the communities, the reality is that many First Nations, we recognize that, or when you hear about First Nations communities, many of the there's a housing shortage, and that's just the reality. So it's often, multiple families living to one house. And when we're talking about social distancing and all of these, when you're having multiple families living in one house, and it's just reality, is that if one person gets exposed, well, now you have a number of different folks, and could be multiple families within there. Is that's those are some of the challenges that we're dealing with. When I talked about those medical capacity, there are, yes, communities can go out and try to access the surrounding medical facilities, but even within major centers and dealing with that, we recognize that we have to be able to respond to those with by limiting our exposure and not being able to overwhelm those medical facilities. And then others is food, access to capacity, and being able to deal with the everyday thing. I've got 2 young children, and so being able to assist and just kind of live a normal life, and having kids going to school and all of those will continue to be a challenge. So it's I would say that those are kind of 3 of the things that are reality. And jobs, like everybody else, First Nations aren't immune to what's happening with businesses shutting down. A lot of jobs, and a lot of folks that I talk to are really concerned about how are we going to be able to pay, or are going to be able to afford food, or what's this going to look like into the future? Will I be able to survive this? They don't know, and they're really worried about that, and those are valid concerns.
Yeah,
Ryan,
I wouldn't mind building on a couple of Steve's points, if that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, what are your top 3s of issues that are impacting?
Yeah, I would also echo one of the bigger concerns we have in First Nations is comorbidity indicators. While you might not have a huge population in their 80s, 90s, you certainly have some, and that family dynamic, as Steve has mentioned, sort of dictates that You don't find very many First Nations that'll have elders homes. You might have elders lodges, but there's not that many where they're separated from the family. However, what you do have is extremely high rates of things like diabetes, asthma, COPD, those type of things that are, from what I've been reading, certainly have some comorbidity issues. Nothing to have 10 to 15 people in a house. And remember, these aren't 2,500 or 3,500 square foot houses. These are probably 12 or 1,500 square foot houses with one, maybe two bathrooms if you're lucky. So we have some very big concerns from that perspective. As far as the government help on this, again, it's unprecedented, so it's a little bit disingenuous for me to be too hard and too difficult on them, but things don't move as quickly, obviously, when it's coming from more centralized governments. And unlike many of us that could go to Costco early on and drop $2,000 or $1,500 for my family of four, most First Nations can't do that. People can't do that. You're going to have some financial barriers from that perspective. Food security is a big concern for people. We're now to the point where you're not wanting people to leave the reserve either. We're not wanting them to go into the cities and come back. Stonies we're in a little bit of a unique position in that we're actually 3 reserves. So we have Morley that most people are familiar with, where the casino is, and you drive through it when you go between Calgary and Banff. We have somewhere in the range of, and this is what we're working on today, 18 to 20 entrances into the reserve. And you contrast that with another reserve we have called Eden Valley, sort of west of Longview. It has 1 entrance. Or Bighorn, which is sort of close to Nordegg, it's got 3 entrances. It's very, very, very difficult for us to close down Morley. We're trying to take steps to do so, but it's next to impossible for us to do it. It does bring up the issue of we don't have enough security staff. We don't, much like the Musqueam bands, we don't have a tribal police force. So we rely on the RCMP from Cochrane. Unfortunately, they're getting heavily taxed as well in what they're having to respond to. So we're having some difficulty, and we have great fear that once it gets in our communities, and it's a when, not an if, it gets into our communities, it's going to probably, I'm worried that it have higher impact than sort of a non, and especially being in the Calgary region, which what we would fall into, even in the Bull Corridor, this is the hotbed for this province, what we have. From a financial and a business perspective, one of the other main concern that then I would have is we also, as part of our ICS, have done a business continuity, which is not just our business is, but it's how do we keep our tribal administration, our government running. We certainly have some concerns around what do we do with things like the casino. We still have a lot of hard costs that are coming out every single month, but we have no revenue coming in. And some of our industries were able to, and businesses were able to effectively mothball like everybody else, but some are not. And as far as the stimulus packages work, we do have to watch in First Nations, because out of that $82 billion that was initially announced, that's now gone up from the feds, 50 or 60 of that was tax incentives and tax breaks. And that starts to change a little bit when you get into First Nations, especially individuals. Tax breaks become a difficult thing to measure because there might be a different taxation rate that you're working with. So we have to watch what's really going to happen. And as far as the money is moving, I think so far we've managed to, I think there was 125,000 to go to Steve's point that moved originally. I know there is some other monies behind that. I've seen the agreements accepted. I don't know if the dollars have come in, but we're pushing a month right about now. That most of us, I think we declared a state of local emergency on the 17th. So we're pushing a month now with really no funding. So luckily we're a large enough nation that we probably have some liquidity that we can access, but for how long? And the fear that we also have is I'm going to steal from Paul to pay Peter out of one group that I may have funding for the year on, how we have some heartburn, or I have some heartburn as an administrator about how is that going to be accounted for at the end, because we don't have very great criteria of what are going to be allowable expenses for us. We can say food somewhat, PPE probably. So we have a little bit of concern on what that's going to look like. And as I said, unfortunately, we have the experience of having a fairly large natural disaster 7 years ago with the floods, and quite often you get different levels of government. You get that cross-jurisdictional issue where the province blames the feds and the feds blames the province, and both blame us, and we both blame both of them. And at the end of the day, we could get stuck holding the bag for, I mean, Lord only knows, millions of dollars by the end of this. Who knows? Depends how long this goes on. So that's a serious concern I have as well from a business perspective.
If I could add to, I guess on Ryan's point there, and you know, he brings up a number of valid points, and one thing that may not be general knowledge, and as well is that you know, many First Nations folks live off reserve. About 50% of First Nation communities, or I think it was a number around somewhere around 52%, and you know, don't quote me on those numbers, but live within urban areas. So many of those dollars that flow to the communities are dealing with the communities themselves. So there are some challenges with those members that are also living in urban areas that you know, they're trying to figure out how, you know, like Calgary, how do you address that if you don't, you know, if you're some dollars that are flowing to communities don't necessarily hit those that are living with those urban areas. So there is a bit of a not so much a disconnect, but a bit of a gray area there. Is that, well, yes, you belong to the First Nation community, but can you access those same dollars and all of that? And like Ryan's point is that you know, those criteria aren't necessarily clearly defined. And so there plays a lot of you know, there's a lot of moving parts, if you will, that are at play. You know, with myself, I live about two hours south of our community from Musqueam, and for us, it's, you know, looking at just my everyday thing is, I mean, well, you know, our community is trying to reach out and help out as much as they can. But that being said, they've got a lot of challenges even dealing with within their own Four Nations. They're doing a great job. They've got a, you know, fantastic emergency response plan, and folks that are working in there, so they do have that capacity. But not every nation, like Ryan was saying, is that not every nation has that, or necessarily has been able to, or is at that point. So it's recognizing how do we, you know, we're sharing a lot of that information across the country with different communities, with different First Nations, you know, talking about what's working, what's not working, how can we support each other, and how can we support you know, those surrounding communities. Musqueam is located in between Wetaskiwin and Ponoka. So the leadership of those three communities have been in contact with each other, and recognizing that just because it happens in Wetaskiwin or Musqueam, or you know, something occurs in Ponoka, doesn't isolate you from those others. We see how fast this thing has been spreading, and how we need to be able to support each other in these times. Is that we need to come together, and you know, it is a very challenging situation, but something that you know, when we support each other, we're able to. I think we'll eventually get there.
So a question that we have here will be, what best practices from First Nations could be brought into the industry for other industries that you guys have seen?
Yeah, if I could do that, yeah. I guess one of the things that we're adopting, and I guess from the side of things, is that there's been a lot of a lot of curbside and that kind of delivery, and understanding that we need to be able to get out to those remote areas. So how do you do program delivery and all of that? Many First Nations don't necessarily have that high-speed internet. So the chances of having online courses are, while they are challenging and with that technology gap there, that's a reality for some communities. That's how some programs are being delivered. So it's being able to do that outreach, that constant communication. We've had, and a big shout out to, CFWE in Calgary and Edmonton that broadcast, and they're reaching out to different First Nation groups to be able to, deliver messages from organizations out to communities, and talking about what kind of supports can you provide, how can you do some outreach to communities, who to contact, where are those resources. So a lot of that information is coming together, always going back to, starting at the federal government level, looking at what the government of Canada is saying, what is the province saying, what are local municipalities saying, and then from there, what are other organizations, like in those in the Calgary area, like the Calgary Native, the Friendship Centers, what are organizations like IRC doing? Those messages are getting out there. The Circle for Aboriginal Relations, how are they responding to that? How can you provide supports? So there's a lot of that that's coming together. Dissemination of information has really been key in these areas, is being able to both provide real-time data and stats, facts, and figures. Where is this happening? And then being able to understand, okay, well, how do we protect our communities, and how do we provide those supports and then to assist going on that day to day.
So Gabe, were you asking what can as best practices that First Nation can share with industry?
Yeah, basically, what do you guys have seen as practices that you think could be useful for other industries as well, that First Nations are applying to this crisis?
Yeah, like I said, we took best practices from industry and brought it to First Nations, and in using something like ICS. I think, to build a little bit then on Steve's point, I think we also are learning and starting to show industry how can groups that perhaps have a lot more disadvantages, how are we able to overcome some of the social distancing, especially when it becomes very culturally driven too, that you would have, it's nothing to have 2, 3, 4 generations in a house. We're struggling a little bit, as Steve said, and I think some of this will come out, that we may not have, as you're having a problem with my Wi-Fi, although I could probably switch to another server and we'd be okay. Not only do we not necessarily have Wi-Fi in lots of our communities, the reality is I actually had to go into town and try to buy some laptops because we're trying to order them, and some Surface Pros. Remember, all the schools shut down and many businesses shut down. It was even accessing the hardware for us to use. That was extremely difficult. So we're trying to find different ways to keep our people plugged in, because this is everybody in the world trying to do these things all at the same time. We are and can probably share how it is to be poor, and it can be expensive to be poor. So we're having to come together and try to buy things as an aggregate rather than as 3 separate tribes, just trying to learn some economies of scale and learn to bring some things in. Our first food hampers, we had 11, we sent them out by house, and we had 1,100 of them to go out to 3 different reserves. And we learned right away we needed to figure out how to buy it, because you can't walk into Safeway and buy 1,100 bags of flour. So we had to learn how to use all of our businesses to use those relationships and leverages, whether it was Cisco or GFS are the 2 big ones that we used. Bring them all back to our casino and then break them out into how we needed them for hampers to go to houses. So, sometimes it's, like I said, it is expensive to be poor, and sometimes it's us learning creative ways, and instead of everybody only taking care of yourself like we might do in the suburbs of whatever city, we have to keep in mind that culturally we have to take care of everybody all at once. It's not an option. It's not a question that we only just take care of my own house. I have to take care of the community, because that's just culturally how it's set up. And I think that might be one of the better lessons that we can offer to our non-Indigenous friends is, to Steve's point, if one person is left out and somebody gets sick or something happens, this doesn't care. It doesn't care. COVID doesn't care about your financial ability. COVID doesn't care about your ethnicity. COVID doesn't care about whatever dynamic is. Right. So we have to understand and look at this from a holistic community level rather than sort of an individual panic buying. Yeah, toilet paper in Steve's house over his shoulder. So as long as we don't act like that, we should be good, right? But we just don't have those type of things happen out here.
Yeah, there's. I guess if I could try to look at try to find some positives and something and maybe some of the folks that are attending and watching and participating in this webinar is that may be some opportunities for the chamber members to be able to engage with First Nations. Is that exactly as Ryan was saying? Is that when you look at it and you go, okay, well, I'm dealing with the one First Nation and I'm or one person, an individual, and how do you roll out some of these emergency response plans? Well, some communities have gone out and said, okay, well, we're going to be able to, distribute X number of dollars to our members, and they can go and figure it out. Whatever they need, they'll handle it. Others, like Ryan, and even in some cases in our community back home in Sampson, is that we've gone out and we've done those large-scale purchases from vendors. So that might be an opportunity for those chamber members to reach out and work with First Nations, because you're looking at this. Well, how does this affect me? And okay, well, I'm living in Calgary. I'm not necessarily from a First Nation. I don't really do business with a First Nation. Well, here's an opportunity where maybe we're talking about how do we buy local. We've seen things like, and this is just reality, came out this weekend, is that Amazon and Balzac has recently been impacted from COVID-19. So in some of the cases where down in the States, that entire facility has been shut down. Now, that is concerning for members out here in Calgary, but well, how does that, you can't necessarily get those items delivered to your community. So that's an international organization. Whereas we're talking about now, how do we buy local? How do we support local? Maybe it's reaching out to those communities saying, okay, well, I own ABC grocery store or chain or something like that. Here, I understand that we're going through this. How can we work together to be able to solve this? And not only supporting those, those businesses, because we recognize that there are, Calgary is made of love and mom and pop shops. That the chamber is. We have many national and large-scale companies. There's also those everyday, those sole proprietors, those entrepreneurs that are out there. So it's working together to be able to continue to get through this. That First Nations are not immune to the downturn that's happening. We're talking about some of this maybe in tune and seeing what's happening with oil. Oil and gas is having a big effect within the Calgary market. We're seeing where WTI if this whole deal wasn't going to with OPEC Plus wasn't going to come into and happen, we were going to start paying people to take our oil. So those are just some of the realities. Well, oil and gas for royalties on First Nations have been affected massively. In 2011, 2012, and there's a letter that we've from Indian Resource Council that we put out to the Prime Minister, just talking about this. It's available on our website, so check it out at irccanada.ca. But here's some of the figures: is that 2011, 2012, oil and gas royalties for First Nations were approximately 250 million. Last year, 2018, 2019, those shrunk to 50 million. Now, when you think about it and you go, okay, so what does that mean? Well, many of these First Nations, I'm not going to speak for Ryan, but with even within our community, Muscat cheese is involved in we've got the Bonnie Glen field, which was one of the largest finds in in recent history. But those oil and gas revenues often will supplement what income that comes into the community. So they'll be able to help out with the impact of the everyday shortage of housing, of infrastructure, and all of this kind of thing. Now, without those revenues there and going into those, many communities are going, okay, that little extra that was coming from the oil and gas industry, that was helping to pay for our education programs, that was helping, in Ryan's case, when we were talking about that, being able to respond and purchase laptops for those kids, it's not there anymore. So we're seeing those impacts that are happening across the country, and we're trying to figure out, okay, so how do we respond to this? First Nations, from individual perspective on nation to nation, some are large producers, like an Onion Lake, or like communities that are involved around Fort Mac, and tied in with many other nature benefit agreements. But then there are others that are really small players. So it's having a large impact across the country. Like I said, it's how do we ultimately bring those back, and seeing that all of these external factors are continuing to handle First Nations that are they're trying to figure out just dealing with their day-to-day. Now you add this on top, and now it's kind of going, well, okay, so when you're scrambling, what are some of the solutions? Well, now it's reaching out and understanding that those that are in your circle, like those chamber members. So it's going, how can those chamber members that are involved in the day-to-day of providing food or whatever have you, medical supplies, First Nations need those, and they're looking to buy them in large quantities. So how can we work together on this?
Definitely. It's definitely a community effort, and it will continue to be one, like you mentioned. So guys, I think we're looking to wrap up here. If you have any closing remarks that you'd like to leave us with, please do so.
Yeah, I think it's going to build a little bit on what Steve was saying as well. And this was starting to happen even before the pandemic hit. There's been some very interesting studies from guys like Kelly Lindsay that are probably at Indigenous Works, that are probably are worth looking at. And he used some of his data out of Stats Canada. And that's into understanding, especially, I'm going to be a little bit Alberta centric or prairie centric here. If we look at the resource sector, which is not just oil and gas, but mining, forestry, etc., it's recognizing that non-Indigenous Canadians, about 7 out of 100, 7% of non-Indigenous Canadians make their living in those sectors. For Indigenous people, it can be 18 to 20%. So you can be 2.5, 3 times as likely if you're an Indigenous person to be working in those sectors than if you're not. So understanding that every time there's a downturn, whether it's killed by regulation or whether it's shut down because of a pandemic, the implications to Indigenous people are more pronounced even than they are to non-Indigenous people. So I think it's important for us to look at that, of even out of those people that we're working, we've now got that much higher of a chance that they're not working. So I think it's something for us to keep in mind of how this is going to impact our communities. And most nations out here have recognized that from a while ago, and that's why they tend to be positive proponents in the resource sector. I think the other thing I'd like to leave people with is don't fall for the belief that the government's going to come in and save everything for us. And what I tell my nations out here now is, when I'm going to be a little bit nicer about this than I probably should be, when there is a disaster like a flood or hail or fire or what have you, they tend to be quite localized, and help can come from different parts of the province or the country or the world for that matter. But we're unprecedented now, and the messaging that we're getting is from the governments is, oh yeah, go ahead, spend a whole bunch of money, and we'll sort everything out at the back end. What I think is with any kind of malintent whatsoever, it's just scary for us, because what does that mean? And so we're still having difficulties. As I said, we're fairly well planned out, but we're still having difficulties about accessing the same PPE as everybody else has. If I have an isolation center in Morley set up for 150 people, I'm trouble getting personal protective equipment, or I'm still having trouble getting staff to work that type of thing. So understand that we're suffering from the same ills as all your non-Indigenous neighbors are. We don't have, because it doesn't exist, some sort of government intervention or the Red Cross or something like that that's going to be able to fly in and to help us. And we're starting with groups that may have had multiple barriers, be it health or financial or physical or overcrowding or what have you. And so just sort of realize that there are others that still need help, no matter how well organized we are.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess from my side of things is, yeah, like echo all of the comments that Ryan has made there. You know, there's a lot of, there are many challenges that communities are dealing with. You know, hats off to those that are coming together and that are, you know, I try to, I guess, find the positive and things, and something that we always look for in our communities is that there's always plenty of volunteers. So I guess we'll try to look at, even with the positive side of things, is that there are many volunteers that are coming in these times of you know, challenges. We hear about all of the stats and everything like that, but there are those that are coming in and trying to figure out, okay, how do we solve these situations? How do we solve the challenges? Multiple families. I don't want to see my family get sick. So how can I go out and have one person go out and, you know, do the grocery runs and all of that, and trying to limit through social distancing. We're very social networks, and we're very social. You know, we're just social people by nature. Indigenous communities are no different. We love going out there and giving hugs to everybody, and to not be able to do that, and it's called, you know, culturally that's ingrained within us, and so it's a bit of a challenge in that way. It's learning to adapt. Economically, many are out there that are really wanting to get back to work. You know, from our side of things, from Indian Resource Council, we're in the midst of rolling out a lot of online training and online platforms to get those folks. We recognize pipelines are still being built. You know, projects are still happening out there. So we're going to need workers. And whenever this our economic and our economies and our, you know, the country has kind of started back up, is that we're now, as a, you know, while it is challenging, we've got to look at how can we be ready for that ramp up, and how can we look at some positives while dealing with these everyday to-day challenges. So those are some of the you know, some of the activities that we're trying to prepare for. From you know, on the everyday side of things, supporting your neighbor, looking at those members from the chamber of you know, how can we support our local businesses, because we recognize that it's not the big glass towers that are downtown Calgary, where we recognize that those, yes, they are a huge player in our communities, that it's our neighbor and our mom and pop shops and those folks that are out there, is that you know, we're all in this together. That you know, it's everybody that's being affected, so let's work together on that.
Thank you so much, guys, for joining us and sharing your perspectives here. I think it's really helpful. Just a reminder to everyone that this was recorded and will be available on our channels for later today, and you can share with anyone you want to. So thank you very much again, guys, for joining us, and thank you everyone for watching.
Thank you.